Uncover the hidden truth behind why nations go to war in this deep dive into global conflicts. From resource wars to territorial disputes, discover the real motivations that drive countries to violence. We examine historical patterns, modern conflicts, and the psychology of warfare to reveal what textbooks don't teach you. Learn how economics, politics, and human nature combine to create the perfect storm for war. This analysis exposes the uncomfortable realities of international relations and why peace remains so elusive. Subscribe for more geopolitical insights and share your thoughts on the root causes of conflict. Script. Throughout human history, the sound of war drums has echoed across continents, marking the beginning of conflicts that would reshape borders, topple governments, and cost millions of lives. From ancient Mesopotamian city-states fighting over river access to modern superpowers engaging in proxy wars, the reasons nations choose violence over diplomacy follow patterns that are both disturbingly predictable and deeply revealing about human nature itself. Today, we're going to strip away the patriotic rhetoric, the noble justifications, and the sanitized history lessons to examine the raw, uncomfortable truth about why countries actually go to war. The conventional narrative taught in schools suggests that wars are unfortunate accidents, the result of misunderstandings, evil dictators, or the inevitable clash of incompatible ideologies. But this sanitized version obscures a far more complex and often darker reality. Wars are rarely spontaneous eruptions of violence. They are calculated decisions made by leaders who have weighed costs against benefits and concluded that the potential gains outweigh the risks. Understanding this calculation is crucial to understanding why, despite thousands of years of human progress, we still live in a world where armed conflict remains a constant threat. The most fundamental driver of warfare throughout history has been the competition for resources. This isn't just about oil or gold, though those certainly matter. It's about water, fertile land, strategic locations, and increasingly rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. When one group controls something that another group needs for survival or prosperity, the stage is set for conflict. The underlying equation is simple. If the value of what you want exceeds the cost of taking it by force, war becomes an economically rational choice. Consider the colonial expansion of European powers. The official justification was often spreading civilization or Christianity, but the real motivation was securing access to spices, precious metals, and new markets. The British didn't conquer India to bring them parliamentary democracy. They conquered it to control the incredibly lucrative trade routes and resources that made Britain wealthy enough to dominate global politics for centuries. The moral justifications came later, crafted by intellectuals who needed to reconcile their nation's actions with their civilized self-image. This pattern continues today in more subtle forms. The conflicts in the Middle East aren't really about democracy or fighting terrorism, despite what politicians claim. They're about controlling the world's most important energy reserves and the strategic waterways through which they flow. The nation that controls Middle Eastern oil doesn't just control energy prices. They control the lifeblood of industrial civilization itself. Every major power understands this, which is why the region has been in almost constant conflict for decades. But resources alone don't explain war. If they did, every resource-rich nation would be constantly invaded, and every resource-poor nation would be constantly invading. The reality is more nuanced. War happens when leaders believe they can achieve their objectives through violence more effectively than through peaceful means. This calculation depends on military capabilities, economic strength, political stability, and crucially, the perceived resolve of potential opponents. The concept of security dilemmas plays a crucial role in this calculation. When one nation builds up its military to defend itself, neighboring nations interpret this as a threat and respond by building up their own forces. This creates a spiral of mutual suspicion and military escalation that can eventually lead to war, even when neither side originally intended to fight. The arms race between Germany and Britain before World War I is a classic example. Both nations were responding to what they perceived as threats from the other, but their defensive preparations ultimately made war more likely, not less. Territory represents another fundamental cause of warfare, but not just because nations want more land. Territory provides strategic advantages, natural barriers, access to resources, and symbolic importance that goes far beyond its economic value. The ability to project power, defend your population, and control critical choke points often depends on controlling specific pieces of geography. Mountains provide natural fortifications, rivers provide transportation and barriers, and coastlines provide access to maritime trade routes. The emotional and psychological aspects of territorial disputes make them particularly dangerous. Land isn't just real estate to most people, it's home, identity, and connection to ancestors. When groups believe they have a historical or cultural claim to territory currently controlled by others, rational cost-benefit analysis often gives way to emotional decision-making. The willingness to fight and die for seemingly worthless pieces of land makes sense only when you understand that territory represents far more than its material value. Modern conflicts in places like Kashmir, the South China Sea, and Eastern Europe all involve territorial disputes where the strategic and symbolic value of the land far exceeds its economic worth. These aren't accidents or misunderstandings. They're conflicts where multiple parties have calculated that the benefits of controlling disputed territory outweigh the costs of fighting for it, even when those costs include massive human suffering and economic destruction. The role of domestic politics in driving international conflict is often underestimated but critically important. Leaders facing internal challenges frequently find that external enemies provide a convenient way to unite their population and distract from domestic problems. The concept of rally around the flag effect describes how populations typically support their leaders during times of external threat, regardless of how they felt about those leaders before the crisis began. This creates a powerful incentive for struggling leaders to manufacture or escalate international tensions. A leader facing economic recession, political scandal, or social unrest might find that a small, victorious war provides exactly the boost they need to maintain power. The Falklands War perfectly illustrates this dynamic. The Argentine military junta was facing massive domestic unrest and economic collapse when they decided to invade the British-controlled islands. The war temporarily united the Argentine people behind their government, though their ultimate defeat actually hastened the regime's collapse. The psychology of group identity and us versus them thinking makes populations surprisingly willing to support wars that serve their leaders' interests rather than their own. Humans are tribal creatures who evolved in small groups where loyalty to the in-group and suspicion of outsiders was essential for survival. Modern propaganda exploits these ancient instincts, portraying foreign nations as existential threats to everything the population holds dear. Once a population is convinced that their way of life is under attack, they become willing to make enormous sacrifices to defend it. Economic factors drive warfare in ways that go far beyond simple resource competition. The desire to control trade routes, establish favorable trade agreements, protect domestic industries, and access new markets has motivated countless conflicts throughout history. The Opium Wars weren't about drugs. They were about Britain's determination to force China to accept British-manufactured goods and maintain the trade relationships that kept the British economy prosperous. Modern economic warfare often takes subtler forms, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Trade wars, sanctions, and currency manipulation are all attempts to achieve through economic pressure what previous generations achieved through military force. When these economic tools fail to produce the desired results, or when the stakes are high enough, nations may still resort to traditional warfare to protect their economic interests. The concept of preventive war represents one of the most dangerous patterns in international relations. This occurs when a rising power appears to threaten an established power's dominance, leading the established power to attack before the rising power becomes too strong to defeat. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta followed this pattern, as did many of the conflicts that shaped European history. The underlying logic is simple. If you're going to have to fight eventually, it's better to fight when you're still stronger than your opponent. This dynamic becomes particularly dangerous when combined with technological changes that might shift the balance of power. The development of nuclear weapons, cyber warfare capabilities, or advanced artificial intelligence could potentially give early adopters such overwhelming advantages that other nations feel compelled to act before these advantages become insurmountable. The window of opportunity for preventive action may be narrow, creating pressure for quick decisions that leave little room for diplomatic solutions. The role of alliance systems in spreading and escalating conflicts cannot be ignored. Nations form alliances to increase their security, but these same alliances can turn local disputes into global wars. When nations are bound by treaty obligations to support their allies, a conflict between any two alliance members can quickly draw in multiple other nations. World War I began as a dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but escalated into a global conflict largely because of the complex web of alliances that bound European nations together. Modern alliance systems like NATO operate on similar principles. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all members, which theoretically deters aggression, but also means that any conflict involving an alliance member could potentially escalate far beyond its original scope. This creates both stability and instability. The certainty of alliance support may prevent some conflicts, but it also means that when conflicts do occur, they're likely to be larger and more destructive. The changing nature of warfare itself influences when and why nations choose to fight. Traditional warfare required massive armies, extensive supply lines, and clear territorial objectives. Modern warfare increasingly involves cyber attacks, economic sanctions, proxy forces, and hybrid threats that blur the lines between war and peace. These new forms of conflict may be more attractive to leaders because they offer the possibility of achieving strategic objectives without the massive costs and risks associated with traditional military operations. However, the lower barriers to entry for these new forms of warfare may actually make conflict more likely, not less. When the costs of aggression are lower, the threshold for deciding to act aggressively is also lower. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic warfare can be conducted with limited risk of escalation, at least initially. But these supposedly limited conflicts have a tendency to escalate as each side responds to the other's actions with increasingly aggressive measures. The role of individual leaders in driving nations toward war deserves special attention. While structural factors like resource competition and security dilemmas create the conditions for conflict, individual leaders ultimately make the decisions that determine whether disputes escalate into warfare. The personality, psychology, and personal interests of key decision-makers can be just as important as broader strategic considerations in determining whether a nation goes to war. Authoritarian leaders may be particularly prone to choosing warfare because they face fewer domestic constraints on their decision-making, and may benefit personally from the rally around the flag effect that wars typically produce. Democratic leaders face more constraints, but they are also subject to public opinion, which can sometimes demand aggressive action in response to perceived threats or provocations. The interaction between individual psychology and institutional constraints creates complex dynamics that make predicting when leaders will choose war extremely difficult. The uncomfortable truth is that war often works, at least for the victors. Despite the enormous human and economic costs, successful military campaigns can achieve objectives that would be impossible to achieve through peaceful means. The United States became a continental power through warfare against Mexico and Native American tribes. Germany and Japan became major industrial powers, partly through successful military campaigns that gave them access to resources and markets. Even unsuccessful wars sometimes achieve their objectives by demonstrating resolve and willingness to fight. This success rate, even if it's less than 50%, is enough to keep warfare as a viable policy option in the minds of leaders around the world. If war never worked, rational leaders would stop choosing it. The fact that it sometimes works means that the threat of warfare will always be present in international relations, regardless of how much we might wish otherwise. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction has changed the calculation somewhat by making the costs of warfare potentially catastrophic, but it hasn't eliminated the underlying incentives that drive nations to fight. Instead, it has pushed conflict toward lower-intensity forms that stay below the threshold that might trigger nuclear retaliation. Proxy wars, cyber attacks, and economic warfare allow nations to pursue conflicting interests without risking mutual annihilation. Looking toward the future, several trends suggest that the underlying drivers of warfare are likely to intensify rather than diminish. Climate change will create new resource scarcities and force large populations to migrate, creating new sources of conflict. Technological advances will create new forms of warfare and new strategic advantages that nations will be tempted to exploit. The rise of new powers and the decline of others will create the kind of power transitions that have historically led to major wars. Understanding why countries go to war doesn't make these conflicts inevitable, but it does make them predictable. The patterns that have driven warfare throughout human history continue to operate today, adapted to new technologies and circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged. Resources, territory, security, domestic politics, economics, and individual ambition continue to create the conditions where leaders conclude that violence serves their interests better than peace. The hope for reducing warfare lies not in expecting human nature to change, but in creating institutions and incentives that make peaceful resolution of disputes more attractive than violent solutions. This requires understanding the real motivations behind conflict and addressing them directly, rather than simply condemning war as irrational or evil. Only by acknowledging the uncomfortable truth about why nations choose to fight can we hope to create a world where they choose not to.